Okay, part three, adaptive tests. Now, adaptive tests are the way of the future. Eventually, things will always be like this when there's money and technology to support it. But adaptive tests are just tests that change according to the test taker's behavior. Now, if we're trying to figure out what this looks like, and I'm sure some of you have heard of this before, what it starts out with, it gives you a question. And if you get that question right, it gives you a harder question. And if you get that question right, it gives you another harder question until you get one wrong, at which point it gives you easier questions until you get one right, and then harder, and then easier, and so on and back and forth until it kind of figures out where you're at. Now, if you look at all these different dots, one of the cool things about this is they have these little bars around it. That again is kind of the true score range, or that similar to that percentile rank range. And it just says that, yeah, you got this question right. We think your ability level's right here because that's how hard this question was, but it could be somewhere in here. We're not sure. Could be out of there, but we're pretty confident right now it's in here. Now you get the next question and we change that. We're like, well, actually, no, now you're probably between here and here. And then we give you another question that if you would have gotten it right, we would have assumed you were here, but now we kind of modify until we're back down here, go up, down until kind of we get here, and you're actually just slightly above where we thought you were to begin with. But if you look all the way down here, those bars have gotten really close together. Now, the way that these things work is sometimes these tests keep going until that bar gets small enough, and then it stops. Other times they're just because you're trying to not take forever, because kids answer questions in weird ways sometimes. You might have 10, 20 questions, and just trying to get as close as you can and reduce it as much as you can in that time. So, basics of adaptive testing. One, the test changes according to how the user responds. Okay. Now, another fact about these tests that's great is that because it changes and adapts to you, it actually will give you a much better estimate of where you're at if you are a really high performer or a really low performer. Remember how we talked about, or how I mentioned, you weren't saying anything, right? How I talked about how standardized tests have a lot of kind of average questions and they don't have a lot of really hard questions to get the high performers or really low questions to get the low performers, because that won't help them figure out where everyone else is at, because most people are kind of in the middle. Adaptive tests, though, allow us to test outside of the normal proficiency range. So if I have a student who is, very far above grade level, I can zero in really closely on where they are. Just like if I have a student who's well below grade level, I can also zoom in on where they're at. Now, if we're thinking about other advantages, there are four that I want you to think about. One, shorter tests can be just as reliable, just as good as longer tests. The great thing about adaptive tests is you can get more reliable answers in a shorter number of time. One of the rules for reliability that we talked about was that longer tests in general are more reliable. In this case, I can have a shorter test that is just as reliable or even maybe more reliable than a longer test because I'm not wasting my time asking a bunch of questions that don't tell me anything, right? And that's a great thing. Number two, tests can be more accurate, especially at the extremes of ability. As we just saw, when you have high or low performers, I can really hone in on what their true ability level is. Number three, because it's all computer-based, results are available immediately. They're compiled. They can get put in reports. It's all pretty fascinating, pretty fantastic. And when I was a kid, we got our test scores the next year from the previous year. And I don't know what it's like with you these days or when you can remember getting those test scores back. But what were you supposed to do with those? They were kind of talked about at parent-teacher conferences, but so what? It was like last year, right? So it's great that you get a faster turnaround time. Number four, they're better suited for making comparisons over time. One of the great things about these test scores, because they give questions that aren't just tied to grade level, but they're tied to skill level, is that I can make some meaningful comparisons from second to third to fourth to fifth to sixth grade and so on. because I'm not just tied to the stuff that's taught in those particular grades. What these scales of measurement use is something called the RIT scale or the Roche unit scale. Um, it, like normal curve equivalence, it has an equal or interval nature to it, meaning that the points are always the same no matter where you are on the spectrum. Um, it also represents what the student has actually learned. Now, the way that they do this is they break down math, say, into bigger categories like number sense or algebraic functions and so on, or fractions. And they look at, well, what do fractions look like in a very simple form when they're first introduced in like third grade, right? And so what are they going to look like down here? And then they think about, well, what do fractions look like in fifth grade? What do fractions look like in seventh grade? What do they look like in high school? What does number sense look like down here compared to here compared to here? What does algebraic thinking look like down here in these different areas? And they map it all out and they give examples and they do a ton of development of these types of questions, thinking about what are the basic skills in each content area and how do they change over time. What that allows us to do then is have some kind of way to do apples to apples comparisons across the entire continuum, which is a really fantastic thing. Now, this is an example from map testing, and I'm sure that a lot of you have gone through map testing or been in schools that have the map or measures of academic progress software. There are other ones out there. But the idea is that you can actually track how skills are really developing over time. Now, um, I've seen these test scores and they jump all over the place because sometimes kids focus and sometimes they don't. Sometimes kids take it seriously and sometimes they don't. Sometimes kids take their medication if they're on it, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes kids get lucky and sometimes they don't. So scores can be jumping all over the place. It's not perfect, but it is a step in the right direction. Now, um, the final thing that I want to mention is the Wisconsin assessment system. So we've talked about things like MAP, we've talked about the forward exam, and there is a whole system in place to try to figure out where students are at. The forward exam goes on for English language arts and math 3 through 8, and you get science at 4 and 8, and social studies at 4, 8, and 10. A different assessment called dynamic learning maps is used for ELA and mathematics and so on for students who are kind of non-traditional in some sense. You have the ACT Aspire for the higher grades, or ACT, call it ACT. You have the writing, world keys, and so on. These are all on the DPI website, and we're not going to end up talking about them a lot, but I encourage you to go look at them. And there are other assessments for English language learners, other assessments for reading readiness, and other assessments for educational progress as well. Now, these tests get administered at different times, at different regular intervals, but they get compiled to try to figure out, where is education in the state right now? Where is it going? Where has it been? What does it look like? Make sure that you get familiar with whatever grade you're teaching and whatever other district tests are in play for you, that you understand how to read the reports, what they mean, how they map onto the curriculum, and what you can do with it. Standardized tests are mostly for accountability purposes. They're not geared to guide instruction. That's what classroom assessments are for. The closest thing you can get to that are things like the MAP testing, which can help you, but only if you have a curriculum that's aligned with MAP. If you don't, then it's a whole bunch of work, and every time the curriculum changes, everything has to be remapped again. So use your assessments, use the assessments that come with the curriculum to figure out where your students are at, and then use these standardized tests as another data point to see whether or not what you're getting from your students agrees with what the MAP assessment or the standardized test is telling you about them. If it is, great. If it isn't, well, then you have to figure out what's going on. Okay, so for this week, make sure that you complete and look at the standardized test questions, practice problems. the norm reference, practice problems, and so on. And I'll be sending out some more standardized testing questions for you to kind of test your mettle with. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will be happy to respond.